The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Marcus Williams adjusted his worn baseball cap and reached for another case of canned vegetables. To everyone at Hope Haven Food Bank, he was just another volunteer who showed up every Tuesday and Thursday, sleeves rolled up, ready to sort donations and serve meals to families in need. But beneath that humble exterior was the founder and CEO of the Williams Foundation, a multi-million-dollar charity empire that funded food banks across 3 states. He wasn't here to help today. He was here to investigate reports of missing funds, diverted supplies, and corruption that threatened to destroy everything he'd built. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus had started coming to Hope Haven 3 months ago after receiving an anonymous tip that food meant for hungry families was being sold on the black market. As one of the foundation's largest recipients, Hope Haven received over $50,000 in grants annually, plus direct food shipments worth twice that amount. But the numbers weren't adding up. Inventory reports showed full shelves while families were being turned away empty-handed. The warehouse felt different today, colder somehow, despite the October heat still clinging to the afternoon air outside. Marcus moved between the metal shelving units, his trained eye cataloging what should have been there versus what actually was. Where cases of peanut butter should have lined the bottom shelf, only a few scattered jars remained. The produce section, which received fresh deliveries every Monday, looked suspiciously bare for a Thursday afternoon. Sarah Chen had been working the distribution line for 2 years, and Marcus had been watching her carefully. Not because he suspected her of wrongdoing, but because she seemed to be the only volunteer who truly cared about the people they served. While others chatted and laughed during their shifts, Sarah moved with quiet determination, making sure each family received not just food but dignity. She never rushed anyone, never made them feel ashamed for needing help, and somehow always managed to find extra items for families with young children. Marcus noticed how Sarah's shoulders tensed whenever the food bank director, Bill Morrison, walked through the distribution area. Morrison was a large man with a booming voice who loved to talk about his charitable work at community events and church gatherings. But Marcus had done his research. Morrison's salary had increased by 40% over the past 2 years, and he'd recently purchased a vacation home in Florida on what should have been a modest nonprofit income. The afternoon moved slowly as families began arriving for the weekly distribution. Marcus positioned himself at the intake table, recording names and family sizes while observing the flow of supplies. Each family was supposed to receive a balanced selection of proteins, grains, vegetables, and fruits, based on their household size. But Marcus watched as the volunteers consistently ran short on the most valuable items, forcing families to accept substitutions or go without. That's when he saw them. A young father stood in line, holding the hand of a boy who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. The child's clothes hung loose on his small frame, and dark circles shadowed his eyes in a way that spoke of too many missed meals. The father's name was David Rodriguez, and Marcus learned from the intake form that he was recently unemployed after the factory where he worked for 8 years closed down. David had never asked for help before, and the shame was written across his face as clearly as if he'd spoken it aloud. As David and his son reached the distribution table, Marcus watched Sarah's expression change. She'd been maintaining her usual gentle efficiency, but something about this father and child stopped her cold. Maybe it was the way the little boy tried to stand tall despite his obvious hunger, or how David kept apologizing for taking up their time. Sarah began filling their bags with the standard allocation, but Marcus could see her eyes darting to the nearly empty shelves behind her. The protein section was almost bare. Only a few cans of chicken remained, and Morrison had already announced that each family could take just one. The grain supplies were running low too, with most of the rice and pasta already distributed to earlier families. Sarah's hands moved more slowly as she realized she was going to have to send this family home with far less than they needed to make it through the week. Marcus had been documenting everything, but watching this unfold stirred something deeper than his investigative instincts. He'd grown up in poverty himself, remembered the gnawing ache of hunger and the way it made everything else harder to bear. His foundation existed because he never wanted other families to experience what his had endured. But here, in one of the organizations he funded, he was watching it happen right in front of him. David noticed the sparse selection and quickly began making excuses for Sarah, as if it were his fault that the shelves were nearly empty. "Whatever you can spare is more than enough," he said quietly. his hand resting protectively on his son's shoulder. "We're grateful for anything." The little boy nodded solemnly, trying to be brave for his father. Sarah's jaw tightened as she looked at the remaining supplies, then at David and his son. Marcus watched as she made a decision that would change everything. She walked to the back storage area, returning with a case of canned soup that should have been reserved for next week's distribution. Without hesitation, she opened it and filled their bag with 6 cans instead of the allocated 2. But she wasn't finished. Sarah disappeared again, and this time she came back with her own lunch bag. Marcus watched in amazement as she quietly transferred her personal groceries into David's bag. A package of deli meat she'd brought for her own dinner, a loaf of bread she'd picked up on her way to volunteer, even a small container of peanut butter from her own kitchen. "Sarah, you don't have to." David started to protest, but she held up a gentle hand. "Every child deserves a full belly," she said simply. "That's why we're here." Marcus felt something shift inside his chest as he witnessed this act of genuine sacrifice. Here was everything his foundation was supposed to represent, embodied in one volunteer who was giving from her own limited resources because the system was failing the people it claimed to serve. As David and his son walked away with bags that would actually feed them for several days, Marcus noticed Bill Morrison emerge from his office. Morrison's eyes swept over the distribution area, and his expression darkened when he saw the extra supplies Sarah had provided. He strode over to where she was helping the next family, his voice low but sharp enough for Marcus to overhear. "We've talked about this before, Sarah. You can't just hand out extra food because you feel sorry for people. We have budgets to maintain and allocations for a reason." Sarah's voice remained steady, but Marcus could see the fire in her eyes. "That family needed food, Bill." The child was clearly malnourished. "That's not your call to make," Morrison replied coldly. "Stick to the guidelines or find somewhere else to volunteer." Marcus continued his work at the intake table, but his mind was racing. He'd found his corruption, but it wasn't what he'd expected. The missing food wasn't being sold on the black market. It was being hoarded and restricted to make the supplies last longer, allowing Morrison to skim money from the budget while families went hungry. The books would show full distributions, but the reality was systematic underserving of the community's most vulnerable members. Over the following weeks, Marcus maintained his volunteer schedule while quietly documenting the patterns he observed. Morrison would arrive late and leave early, spending most of his time in his office, rather than interacting with the families they served. Meanwhile, Sarah and preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. A few other dedicated volunteers worked tirelessly to stretch the limited supplies as far as possible, often supplementing from their own resources when they thought no one was looking. Marcus began timing his volunteer shifts to overlap with Sarah's, finding excuses to work near her station so he could observe her methods and motivations. He was impressed by how she remembered details about the families who came regularly, asking about job searches and children's school activities, as if these weren't just strangers picking up food but neighbors who mattered to her personally. During a particularly busy Thursday afternoon, Marcus overheard a conversation that crystallized everything he'd been suspecting. Morrison was on a phone call in his office, door partially open, discussing the food bank's operations with someone he addressed as a potential donor. But the numbers Morrison cited bore no resemblance to what Marcus had been observing. "We serve over 300 families weekly," Morrison was saying, providing each household with a full week's worth of nutritionally balanced meals. Marcus had been counting, and the real number was closer to 200 families, most receiving significantly less than a week's worth of food. Morrison continued, "Our overhead costs are minimal, with 95% of donations going directly to food purchases and distribution." Marcus knew from reviewing the Foundation's records that Morrison's salary alone accounted for nearly 20% of Hope Haven's annual budget, and recent equipment purchases seemed inflated compared to market prices for similar items. Morrison was painting a picture of an efficient, high-impact organization, while the reality was a systematic failure to serve the community's needs. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday evening in November. Marcus had stayed late to help with inventory, and the warehouse was nearly empty except for Sarah, who was reorganizing the produce section to make the limited supplies look more abundant for the next day's distribution. She worked with methodical care, arranging apples and oranges so that even small quantities would appear generous to families who might not have seen fresh fruit in weeks. As Sarah worked, she began talking to herself, a habit Marcus had noticed during quiet moments. She wasn't aware that he was still in the building, and her words revealed the weight she carried for every family they served. "The Hendersons have 3 kids under 10, she murmured while counting cans of vegetables. "And Mrs. Patterson's arthritis makes it hard for her to cook anything complicated." She paused at a case of baby formula, her expression troubled. "We're going to run out before we get to everyone tomorrow. How am I going to tell Maria there's nothing for little Sophia?" Marcus realized that Sarah had memorized not just the names, but the specific needs of dozens of families, carrying their burdens as her own. While Morrison treated food distribution like a business operation focused on efficiency and cost control, Sarah approached it as a sacred trust between neighbors in crisis. The next morning brought validation of Sarah's concerns. Marcus watched as family after family left with bags that were noticeably lighter than the week before. By noon, they'd run out of several essential items completely, forcing volunteers to turn away families who had walked miles to reach the food bank. Sarah's distress was visible, as she had to tell a pregnant woman that there was no formula available for her toddler and no milk for her family. That afternoon, Marcus made a decision that would expose his true identity, but felt unavoidable given what he'd witnessed. He waited until the distribution ended and most volunteers had left, then approached Sarah as she was cleaning the serving area. Her movements were slower than usual, weighed down by the disappointment of not being able to help everyone who needed it. "Sarah," Marcus said quietly, "can we talk?" She looked up, surprised to see him still there. Over the past few weeks, they'd developed a comfortable working relationship, but Marcus had been careful to maintain his cover as just another volunteer. Something in his tone now made her pause in her cleaning. "I need to tell you something," Marcus continued, "and I need to ask for your help." Sarah set down her cleaning supplies and gave him her full attention. Marcus took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to reveal would change everything between them and possibly put his entire investigation at risk. "My name is Marcus Williams," he began, watching her face for recognition. "I founded the Williams Foundation, which provides funding to Hope Haven and dozens of other food banks across the region." Sarah's eyes widened, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "I've been volunteering here under false pretenses," Marcus admitted. "We received reports that funds and food supplies were being diverted, and I needed to see the operation firsthand to understand what was happening." The hurt that flashed across Sarah's face was immediate and sharp. "So this has all been some kind of investigation? The families you've been helping, the conversations we've had, none of it was real?" "The work was real," Marcus said urgently. "Every family I helped, every bag I packed, that was real. And what I've seen you do here, the way you care for people, that's the most real thing I've encountered in years of running a foundation." Sarah turned away, and Marcus could see her processing the implications of his deception. When she spoke again, her voice was careful and controlled. "What exactly are you accusing us of?" "Not us," Marcus corrected. "Morrison. He's been systematically underserving families while inflating his reports to donors. The money that should be feeding people is going into his own pocket, and families like David Rodriguez are paying the price." At the mention of David and his son, Sarah's expression shifted from hurt to anger. "You think I don't know that? You think I haven't been trying to compensate for his greed with my own resources for months?" "I know you have," Marcus said. "I've watched you give your own food away more times than I can count. That's why I need your help to document what's really happening here." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring at the empty shelves around them. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a mixture of resignation and determination. "David came back last week. He found work, part-time construction, but it's not enough to support his family yet. His son, Miguel, he's been having trouble concentrating in school because he's hungry." She turned back to Marcus, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "If I help you expose this, what happens to the families we serve? If Hope Haven gets shut down, where do they go?" It was the question Marcus had been dreading, because he didn't have a simple answer. "I don't want to shut down Hope Haven," he said. "I want to fix it, but that means removing Morrison and restructuring the entire operation." "And in the meantime?" Sarah pressed. "While you're restructuring and investigating and doing whatever foundation heads do, what happens to Miguel Rodriguez? What happens to Mrs. Patterson and baby Sophia? Marcus looked around the warehouse, seeing it through Sarah's eyes. This wasn't just a distribution point for charitable supplies. It was a lifeline for families who had nowhere else to turn. And Sarah understood that disrupting it, even temporarily, could have devastating consequences for people who were already struggling to survive. "I don't know," Marcus admitted, "but I know that what's happening now isn't sustainable. Morrison's embezzlement is getting worse, and eventually, the foundation will have to cut funding entirely if we can't account for where the money goes." Sarah nodded slowly, understanding the impossible position they were all in. "What do you need from me?" Over the next several days, Sarah and Marcus worked together to document the discrepancies between Morrison's reports and the actual distributions. Sarah had been keeping informal records of her own, noting when families were turned away or given insufficient supplies, and her detailed observations provided the evidence Marcus needed to build a comprehensive case. The process was emotionally draining for both of them. Sarah had to relive every instance when she'd had to disappoint families who desperately needed help, while Marcus confronted the reality that his foundation's money had been enabling a system that failed the very people it was meant to serve. But their shared commitment to the families who depended on Hope Haven kept them focused on finding a solution. The confrontation with Morrison came sooner than Marcus had planned. On a Thursday afternoon, as Sarah was preparing for the weekly distribution, Morrison stormed over to her station with a clipboard in hand and fury in his eyes. "I've been reviewing the inventory reports," he said loudly enough for other volunteers to hear, "and there are significant discrepancies in the supplies you've been distributing. Food is missing from our storage areas, and I have witnesses who say you've been taking more than the allocated amounts." Sarah's face paled, but her voice remained steady. "I've been giving families what they need, which means stealing," Morrison interrupted. "You've been stealing food that belongs to this organization and giving it away without authorization." Marcus stepped forward from where he'd been sorting canned goods, his volunteer disguise about to be permanently abandoned. "Actually, Bill, the only person stealing around here is you." Morrison spun around, confusion and anger warring across his face. "Who the hell are you two?" "Marcus Williams," Marcus said clearly, removing his baseball cap and looking Morrison directly in the eye. "Founder and CEO of the Williams Foundation, which provides approximately 60% of your annual funding." The warehouse went completely silent. Other volunteers stopped their work to watch the confrontation unfold, sensing that something significant was happening, but not understanding the full implications. Morrison's face went through several color changes as he processed what Marcus had just revealed. "Mr. Williams, I had no idea you were—" "Investigating reports of fraud and embezzlement," Marcus replied calmly. "Reports that have proven to be accurate. You've been falsifying distribution records, inflating your operational costs, and systematically underserving the families who depend on this food bank." "That's ridiculous," Morrison blustered, but his confidence was visibly shaken. "I run an efficient operation here. We serve hundreds of families every week." "You serve fewer than 200 families weekly," Marcus corrected, "and most of them receive significantly less food than your reports claim. Meanwhile, you've increased your own salary by 40% and made equipment purchases at prices that are double the market rate." Sarah watched this exchange with a mixture of vindication and concern. She was glad to see Morrison finally being held accountable, but she knew that his removal would create immediate challenges for the families they served. Morrison's response was to attack. "Even if your allegations were true, which they're not, Sarah Chen has been stealing food from our inventory for months. She's the one you should be investigating, not me." Marcus felt his temper flare at the attempt to scapegoat Sarah, who had been the only person working to ensure families received adequate support despite Morrison's sabotage. "Sarah has been using her own resources to supplement the inadequate supplies you provide," Marcus said. "She's been doing your job while you've been lining your own pockets." The confrontation might have escalated further, but David Rodriguez chose that moment to arrive for the weekly distribution with his son Miguel. The little boy looked healthier than he had a month ago, thanks in part to the extra food Sarah had provided and David's new part-time job. But they still needed the food bank's support to make ends meet. David sensed the tension in the room immediately and hesitated near the entrance, unsure whether he should stay or leave. Miguel pressed closer to his father's side, his young eyes taking in the raised voices and angry faces with the instinctive wariness of a child who had learned that adult conflicts often meant bad things for kids. Sarah noticed them first and immediately moved toward the entrance, her protective instincts overriding the drama happening behind her. "David, Miguel, come on in. We'll get you taken care of." But Morrison wasn't finished with his accusations. "Don't let her pack your bags," he called out to David. "She's been terminated for theft. Any food she gives you is stolen." David looked confused and concerned, glancing between Sarah's stricken face and Morrison's hostile demeanor. Miguel tugged on his father's sleeve, whispering something that made David's expression harden with understanding. "This lady has never stolen anything," David said quietly, his voice carrying more authority than anyone expected from the soft-spoken man. "She's the only person here who treats us like human beings instead of charity cases." Marcus watched this exchange with growing admiration for both Sarah and David. Here were people who understood dignity and compassion in ways that Morrison, despite his position running a charity, clearly did not. Miguel stepped forward, his small voice cutting through the tension. "She gave me extra crackers when I was really hungry," he said, looking directly at Morrison. "My dad says that's called being kind." The simple honesty of the child's words seemed to deflate Morrison's bluster. Other families had arrived for the distribution and were witnessing the confrontation, their faces showing confusion and concern about what was happening to the program they depended on. Marcus realized that this public confrontation was traumatizing for the families who saw Hope Haven as their lifeline, and he needed to find a way to resolve the situation that protected both the integrity of the investigation and the immediate needs of the community. "Morrison, you're terminated effective immediately," Marcus announced. "Sarah, I'd like to offer you the position of interim director while we restructure the organization." Sarah looked stunned. "I don't have any management experience. I'm just a volunteer." "You're the only person here who understands what this place is supposed to be," Marcus replied. "The families trust you, and you know their needs better than anyone." The transition wasn't easy. Morrison left angrily, threatening lawsuits and investigations of his own, but his threats rang hollow once the financial evidence was reviewed by independent auditors. The Williams Foundation provided emergency funding to ensure that Hope Haven could continue operating without interruption while the restructuring took place. Sarah threw herself into learning the administrative side of running a food bank, but she never lost sight of the personal connections that made her effective. Under her leadership, Hope Haven began serving more families with larger allocations, and the atmosphere in the warehouse changed from institutional efficiency to genuine care. Marcus found himself extending his volunteer work even after his investigation was complete. What had started as undercover research had become something more meaningful than his corporate role had ever provided. Working alongside Sarah, he saw how leadership could be about service rather than power, and how real impact was measured in changed lives rather than financial reports. 3 months later, David Rodriguez received a job offer for full-time employment, with benefits that would allow his family to become self-sufficient. But on his last visit to Hope Haven, he brought something more valuable than gratitude. He brought a donation of school supplies for other families and an offer to volunteer his own time helping with deliveries to elderly residents who couldn't travel to the warehouse. "Sarah taught us that receiving help doesn't make you weak," David explained to Marcus as they loaded supplies into his truck. "It makes you part of a community that takes care of each other." Miguel, now healthy and thriving in school, had made a drawing for Sarah, showing her handing out food to families of stick figures, all of them smiling. At the bottom, in careful first-grade handwriting, he'd written, "Thank you for being kind when we needed kindness." As Marcus watched Sarah accept the drawing with tears in her eyes, he realized that his investigation had uncovered something far more valuable than financial fraud. It had revealed the difference between running a charity and truly serving a community, between efficient distribution and transformative compassion. The Williams Foundation restructured its oversight procedures, requiring regular site visits and community feedback assessments at all funded locations. But more importantly, Marcus restructured his own priorities, spending less time in corporate boardrooms and more time in warehouses and community centers where he could see the direct impact of the Foundation's work. On a warm spring afternoon, as Marcus and Sarah worked side by side preparing for the weekly distribution, she asked him something that had been on her mind for months. "Do you ever regret going undercover? I mean, you could have just sent auditors to investigate the financial records." Marcus paused in his sorting of canned vegetables, considering the question. The auditors would have found Morrison's embezzlement, he said finally. But they never would have found you. They never would have understood what this place means to the families we serve, or learned what real leadership looks like. Sarah smiled, the kind of expression that reached her eyes and transformed her entire face. I'm glad you stayed to help rebuild instead of just exposing the problems and walking away. I'm glad you trusted me enough to help, Marcus replied, even after I lied about who I was. As families began arriving for the afternoon distribution, Marcus reflected on how much had changed since that first day when he'd watched Sarah give away her own lunch to ensure David and Miguel had enough food. The warehouse was fuller now, the volunteers more numerous, and the families they served more confident that their needs would be met with dignity and respect. But the most significant change was in Marcus himself. He'd started this investigation as a CEO, protecting his foundation's reputation. He was ending it as a man who had rediscovered the purpose behind his work and found a partner who shared his commitment to making that purpose real in the lives of people who needed it most. David Rodriguez returned the following week, not as someone seeking help, but as a volunteer ready to give back to the community that had supported his family through their darkest time. Miguel came with him, carefully carrying a case of juice boxes that his father had purchased to donate, his young face serious with the importance of his mission. As Marcus watched this family transition from recipients to contributors, he understood that Hope Haven, under Sarah's leadership, had become something Morrison's version never could have been. It wasn't just a distribution point for charity. It was a community where people supported each other through temporary crises and celebrated together when circumstances improved. The success of Hope Haven's transformation became a model for other Williams Foundation programs, but Marcus knew that the real lesson couldn't be replicated through policy changes or administrative restructuring. It could only be embodied by people like Sarah, who understood that true charity wasn't about efficiently distributing resources, but about preserving dignity while providing support, and that the most important qualification for serving others wasn't education or experience, but the capacity to see each person's fundamental worth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.